1 year ago, a single tip lit a fuse on a story that would ripple across the Carolinas and far beyond. It wasn't a press release or a police statement that broke the news. It was a moment in a church service. A pastor announcing from the pulpit the death of his estranged wife, less than a day after authorities found her body in a state park. That woman was Micah Frances Miller. Since that moment, the questions have only grown louder. Why was Micah's death so quickly ruled a suicide? What role did domestic abuse and coercive control play in her final days? And what does this case reveal about our institutions and our media, and how do we respond to stories like hers? Today, we're looking back. This is the team who covered the story from the very beginning, who traveled to Myrtle Beach, mourned with Micah's family, observed every astonishing development with fascination, tenaciously sought truth, and held the line when others looked away. I'm Callie Lyons with FITSNews, and today I'm joined by founding editor Will Folks, research director Jen Wood, and director of special projects Dylan Nolan. Well, when this tip came in last year, did you have any inkling that it would ignite such interest and controversy? We're speaking, of course, of Pastor John Paul Miller's bizarre announcement, which, if it was meant to quiet the inevitable questions about Micah's death, accomplished exactly the opposite. Why did you decide to run with it? And more broadly, what does this case say about the power and responsibility of public tips in investigative journalism?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything in our business is information, and being able to assess it, to be able to look at not only the factual components of it, but also that bigger picture, as you said, the narratives behind the facts, and trying to figure out, okay, exactly what do these facts mean? And more importantly, what does this narrative that wraps around them mean in a larger sense? And so this was one of those tips that, immediately, the news value is immediately evident, because you've got, a young woman in the prime of her life, under questionable circumstances, is no longer with us. And so immediately that's one of the first things that jumps out at you. It's tragic. And so you want to know why. There's a built-in thirst to know why. And so that was one of the first things that, when I started looking at the tip that came in, was, oh my God, what happened to this woman? And then as I started looking at that church service video, where you've clearly got a guy trying to control the narrative. And then when I read the obituary that he wrote for Micah Frances Miller, which was clearly at odds with everything that we were hearing from the first moment we started covering this case. Oh yeah, I mean, Callie, I had an inkling that it was going to be big. Now, did I think it would be as big as it has become? No, I didn't think it would become sort of an international sensation. But certainly the tip that came in, it was immediately evident to me that there was something larger to this story than just the raw facts.
And Jen, covering this case required a deep dive into coercive control and domestic violence. Did this case shift your perspective on what defines a victim, a perpetrator, or even justice itself?
Absolutely. I don't even know if I understood the concept of coercive control prior to the Micah Miller story. And it really forced me to confront how narrow our definitions of abuse and victimhood have been, especially in media narratives. Coercive control isn't loud. It doesn't always leave bruises, but it's just as devastating. And I think it's even more difficult to get out of a situation like that. And, Micah's story challenged me to listen more closely to people that were sending tips in, and, think about what I was hearing, look for the patterns and the behaviors that fall outside of what I traditionally had thought to be criminal. So yeah, I definitely think it has changed how I approach telling stories and talking to people about these situations.
Dylan, as the producer of Week in Review, You've had a bird's eye view of this case as it's developed over time. What stands out to you about the way the narrative has shifted over time? What have been the most significant developments shaping the story?
We'll reference the original news tape, which obviously was eye-popping, just watching how JP unveiled to his flock the death of his wife. But what I think has been interesting about this story, and the reason that we are doing a one-year review, is that there are a lot of other strange things, whether you're looking at Pastor JP or whether you're looking at his father, that week after week, folks who have been associated with both of them have come forth with new information that kind of confirms other fact patterns that have been seen throughout the case.
And they continue to, which kind of amazes me. When Jen said, hey, dig on this and see what you can find, I thought, okay, this is a 2-week-long assignment. Wow.
I think there are a lot of people who have like a one puzzle piece or a couple of puzzle pieces here who, seeing all of this attention on this universe, have kind of said, okay, this is what I've seen, and that's why we're still piecing it all together now.
That's very insightful. Yeah. Well, let's go around the table, and I want to ask each of you, was there a particular moment or a revelation that fundamentally changed your perspective on the case or on Micah's death in particular? And if your perspective hasn't changed, what has emerged that supports your initial impressions? Well, let's start with you.
Well, and I want to be perfectly clear, every day with this story, we are seeing more revelations that I don't know what to do with them. Just this week, Callie, you did an amazing story on sort of a deep dive into the reopened investigation into the death of Chris Skinner, an individual who is linked to, one of John Paul Miller's alleged paramours. So that report blew my mind, for starters. So, excuse me, I don't think it's something. Excuse me, I don't think it's something that's happening just one time. I mean, this story is a constant, roller coaster of just shocking revelations. But the one that started it for me, I think, when I first realized that this story was going to potentially go off the rails, if you will, was when Jen filed her report last spring about the affidavit of John Paul Miller's first wife, Allison Williams, and some of the things that she had alleged that were completely consistent with some of the things that Micah Miller's family members had alleged in the immediate aftermath of her passing. And so when you started to see in those court filings all these people not necessarily tied together, we call that independent confirmation in the business, when you got two sources that are not necessarily talking to each other, or it's clear that these are coming from two totally independent perspectives. But Jen's big report last spring with those court filings from John Paul's first marriage and some of the other things she dug up at the very beginning of the case, for me, that was when I realized that this had the potential to go into a very sinister direction.
Yeah, until then, I think the things the family said, we could have said, oh, they're mourning. They're grieving right now. Give them some space. She really validated their concerns and went much further, actually, with that. Jen, what about you?
It was absolutely that court document, because I had talked to so many of Micah's close friends and family members who had said they're, over and over again, repeatedly, this is not a woman that was, had suicidal tendencies. She was looking forward. She was planning her life. She had just filed for divorce. The papers were served 2 days before her death to John Paul Miller. And when I saw those same friends were telling me the things that were going on in the months leading up to April 27th. And when I saw that filed in a court document in black and white with the supporting documentations as exhibits, I mean, that came in late on a Friday afternoon, and I called Will and I was like, this is huge.
And I don't want to be lame and, say the same thing as everybody else, but I do think that was a huge turning point in this story, because as you two have said, you can put one level of trust in something that one party or one group is saying, but when you see it from a completely separate perspective and folks are seeing the same thing, I think that's when I start to put a lot more stock in what I'm seeing.
Good point. And we've heard relatively little from Allison aside from that affidavit. But
I don't see her trying to make money or trying to, run a revenge tour here. I think she filed this and is kind of letting the courts do their work.
good point. Well, reporting on Micah's story meant confronting topics many media outlets avoid: church abuse, spiritual manipulation, and the sexual abuse of minors by religious leaders. This story coincided with a broader reckoning as lawsuits surfaced against individuals tied to this case and others. Why is it vital to explore these themes? And how do we handle them with care, especially when speaking to a faith-based audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's sensitive anytime you're writing about churches. And one of the things that, Callie, I know you've focused on in your covering of some other scandals here in South Carolina is that these churches often invoke that ecclesiastical authority. Church and state are separate. There are things that the church is supposed to handle that government shouldn't be involved in. And I remember back in the gay marriage debate, FITSNews was always saying, look, this should be up to churches. If your church wants to do that, go to that church. If your church doesn't want to do that, don't go to that church. It's not something government should be involved in. But I think one of the things that everyone has to recognize about these cases is that when certain behavior crosses, a particular line, and again, we're all always trying to find out exactly where that line is and how we recognize it. At some point, the individual rights have to trump that separation. There has to be a balancing act performed in how you cover it. So I think one of the things in this case that it was clear right away was that we were dealing with someone who was actively using his pulpit and position to try and frame the narrative. And again, if you have receipts that support that narrative, great. But once again, as we dug into this, everything that we found from, again, independent sources who were familiar with this pastor and his history and his family history, as you've unearthed, Callie, everything was running counter to the narrative that he was trying to put out there of a wife that loved him like Christ loved the church, and that he was the funniest person she'd ever known, and they had the happiest marriage. It was all bull. I mean, he was a raving mad stalker based on all the evidence that's available to us. And so I think that disconnect, it's important to call that out in any investigation, in any story you cover. But to me, it's especially important to call it out when you've got someone who is actively using a position of authority within the church and even God's name to try to, again, cover up his ills.
Dylan, the case has drawn a massive online following. True crime creators, armchair sleuths, and self-styled investigators. Now, on the one hand, there's so much to this case that it's taken the efforts of so many amateur sleuths to uncover all that we know. But at times, the crowd solving has been a distraction. In your view, where is the line between meaningful investigation and exploitative content?
So I'm not going to be the person to jump down the throat of new media. Obviously, we're a new media outlet here. We've, been derisively called bloggers and talked down to by people in the mainstream media or even other people online who don't like us on plenty of stories. So I think that if you're concerned with facts, concerned with accuracy, and making, a good faith effort, a serious effort to stick to the facts, I'm not going to deride anybody, whether they're in their basement sleuthing, looking at public records, or whether they work for NBC Universal. I think it's a commitment to the facts that matters. That being said, in this case, I've seen a lot of people who don't demonstrate a commitment to the facts, and that's unfortunate. I think this has become a bit of a team sport where there's kind of this team of people who have been aggrieved by their spouses or by their church and see in JP and that church everything that they don't like about the things in their life. And of course, I understand where they're coming from, but as somebody who's here, I don't have a side. I'm here to report facts that we can confirm and bring to our audience. And I think that that's the correct way to approach something like this if you're coming at it from the perspective of a media outlet and not from the perspective of an activist. And I think the people who have gotten out far over their skis in this are doing themselves a disservice and, creating a situation where they're also exposed to legal liability.
Good point. Yeah. Well, a central theme in this story is law enforcement's failure to protect the vulnerable. Whether through negligence, bias, or ineptitude, their shortcomings are undeniable. Do you believe this case offers any lessons for improving institutional responses going forward?
I don't know. I think in a lot of these situations, we have to acknowledge that maybe sometimes our expectations of law enforcement are unreasonable from the outset. And what I mean by that, not trying to excuse failures on the part of law enforcement, but I also don't want to put them in a position where they are responsible for the adjudication of every dispute at the dinner table. I mean, that is inviting government into our lives on a level that I'm not comfortable with, and I don't think anyone should be comfortable with. I think, again, the question, like we were discussing earlier as it relates to the church and state, the question is, when have we reached a point where someone's individual liberties or their life or their well-being are being taken from them against their will? And I think in Micah's case, when you look at the fact that she was committed apparently against her will, electronic devices of hers taken and used and misused, it appears, that to me is where you reach a point where, okay, that line has been crossed. And I also think you have to look in context at all these things. If you have reports of a situation, maybe perhaps on its face, it may not seem that bad. But if you look at the context of the individuals, I think law enforcement has to do a better job of incorporating that context. And Jen, you and I have talked about this as it relates to drunk driving arrests here in South Carolina, and how in too many cases the law is set up to shield bad behavior and protect bad behavior and people who act in a way that is inconsistent with the liberties we're talking about, as opposed to protecting the victims. And so one of the things that I hope comes from this case is a better sense of where is that line for a police officer? When does someone say, you know what, this isn't just a run-of-the-mill dispute. This is someone's property that is being misused. This is someone's freedom that is being actively constrained. And they also have to do a better job. And I think, Callie, your reporting on this has been excellent. They've also got to do a better job, I think, of recognizing that a lot of times victims in these situations cannot give them the help that they need. And that makes it incredibly tough on police, because they go in these situations and you've got somebody who is clearly being victimized, but they are not in a position where they are either ready or capable of kind of helping themselves. And so I think you've done a great job, Kelly, in your reporting to point out that police have got to do a better job of being sensitive in those situations and recognizing, hey, this is someone who is in danger. Just because they're not telling me that directly or taking the steps that I think they should take, that's something they've got to do a better job of recognizing. So I agree with you completely on that. But I also don't want us to have unrealistic expectations of the police going into these things.
Jen, do you want to add anything to that?
Actually, I was listening very carefully, because those are all very, very good points. I do think, with everything like that, it is an opportunity to learn. And I do hope that, with this case, especially with the numerous times that we saw Micah calling police and seeking help, I do feel like with Micah, there should have been some sort of legal intervention earlier, and hope that there are police agencies keeping an eye on this and thinking their response through.
That is probably one of the areas that this case has educated me on more than anything else, is the interaction between law enforcement and those who suffer from domestic abuse, and how actually inflated expectations on both sides leads to just a lack of any kind of resolution at all. So yeah, definitely there's an opportunity here for education for us and for everyone involved, really. Now, Jen, for Micah's loved ones, the true crime framing can be deeply painful. Yet it's also what kept her story in the headlines. How do we walk that tightrope, telling the truth, honoring the victim, and avoiding sensationalism? How can true crime coverage educate and empower without re-traumatizing?
Because my reporting focuses on true crime primarily, it is something that I think about constantly when I speak with victims, families of victims. And, it really, for me, starts with remembering that these people aren't just a case. They aren't just a story. She was a person. She was somebody's sister, somebody's daughter. She was a lot of people's friends. And remembering that, her life was more than just the circumstances of her death. So, I try to do my best to, weave the person I'm writing about, who they were, into the facts that I'm reporting on. You never want to get too emotionally involved in something, but with Micah it's hard. She was beautiful, she was likable. I constantly think about the videos of her singing and her beautiful voice, and just I think giving these people, these individuals, remembering who they were in the midst of the reporting is an important part of what we do.
Definitely. I want to ask.
Yeah, but one thing, Callie, if I could jump in real quick on that, Callie, one thing that I think people doing this job need to understand, particularly those who want to veer into the advocacy realm, I think you're more effective when you are laying out facts, when you are drawing, credible inferences from those, and then when you are opening your outlet up for scrutiny, for criticism. I mean, I think too many people, like Dylan said earlier, it becomes a team sport, and that may be a way to watch a sporting event or a way to watch a binge show you're on Netflix, but it is no way to approach the search for truth and justice. And I think we do a disservice when we reach to punch, so to speak, as a boxing term. When you try to too hard to make a point at the expense of the integrity of what you're doing. And I think that if you just lay the facts out, draw the reasonable inferences, and then again, open it up to public discussion, I think that's far more effective at attaining the outcomes you're looking for than being a shrill, cackling whatever
It's simply not a black and white situation. It's not the Atlanta Braves versus the New York Yankees or the Democrats versus the Republicans. These are two people who at one point in time loved one another enough to enter into a union that they thought would last until the end of their lives, and that stayed in that union for a significant period of time, and I'm sure had parts of their marriage that they both would look back upon fondly. And so we do a disservice when we take a situation that is extremely gray. Obviously, there are plenty of black, but you can't ignore that and just break it down to an extremely simple good, bad, Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker. That is not what this situation is.
And also, if it is that kind of, the other thing is if it really is good versus evil, and then I'll be honest, in this case, I think it is, but it's better for people to reach that conclusion based on the facts, as opposed to us trying to force feed them a certain perspective. Because again, that to me, people are trying too hard when they do that. They're trying too hard. And to me, just let the case tell the story.
Right.
Well, let's go around with one last question. How has this case impacted you personally or professionally? What will you carry forward in your work as a result? And in your view, what is Micah's enduring legacy? Dylan, let's start with you.
As somebody who's, a younger person, this case has actually made me think a lot about the importance of who you pick as your spouse. And I think that I've done that well in my personal life. I'm engaged right now, and I do not anticipate any JP-like problems in my future. But I think that for everybody who, might be in my shoes, in my stage of life, this case and a couple of other cases we followed, man, if you pick the wrong spouse, you are in for a world of trouble. As far as Micah's legacy, Jennifer just touched on this really well. The part of her life that I'm exposed to the most is the worst part of her life. I've seen beautiful parts of her life, kind of glimpses, but unfortunately, the part that I know the most about is probably not what her legacy will be with the people who love her, the people who knew her best. So I'll let those people define her legacy, those people who knew her, and just because I don't have that personal knowledge of who she was.
Always the voice of reason, Dylan. You're the youngest and most mature of us. You'll always bring the voice of reason. I love it. Jen.
Oh, yeah, that's a hard question. I think, in terms of what I've learned from Micah's story is there's a lot that I have to learn about, reporting and, digging into different aspects of cases. I think Micah's story is what made me start looking into the Brian Bennett with non-fatal strangulation and that proposed law. And, there's just a lot of things that I think I've learned from this case that you can dig into outside of the primary story. Like, are there other things that we're missing that could have prevented this? So, yeah, I think I've learned a lot. I think it's made me a more compassionate listener. I think it's made me more cognizant of searching for the truth, no matter where it ends up. This really could, I remember thinking back when we were first looking at the circumstances of her death and thinking to myself, the most likely scenario, the most likely scenario where this ended up is that this woman got completely overwhelmed by her life and, chose to die by suicide. But they just still weren't adding up, and listening to my gut and just kind of asking questions. And I still don't know that we're ever going to get an answer beyond that. But I do think it's important that we ask those questions and pose those questions because it didn't make sense.
Well, it's your turn.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've learned from this case is that it takes a village of us here on this side of the mic to do it. And, we've talked about some of the team sport players. We've talked a little bit about some of the mainstream outlets that have covered it internationally. But I do think one of the things I've learned in this case is from the very beginning, when we broke it, we didn't try to own it. We didn't try to, take ownership of this story. I think we welcomed all of these different perspectives from all these different types of media that kind of descended on the case. And I think this case is proof that it really does take, the Robbie Harveys, Millie Joy on her TikTok. It takes, voices that are unconventional, that are outside of the structure that we typically deal in, to get to the truth. And again, we were talking earlier about the team sport and how that's not really the best way to advance it. But again, the other side of that sword is a lot of truth comes out of those sources too, and being able to wrap that into that narrative, the bigger narrative. But I think that's the biggest thing I've learned is that, nobody owns these stories. Nobody owns them. And so we're just doing our part to advance them. As far as what Micah's legacy is, I really think Dylan said it best. The people that she touched during her time on this earth, who are still telling her stories, who are still singing her songs, who are still advancing all the good that she wanted to do in life, whether through missions, whether through leading worship. I mean, if you think about it, one of the things that has always touched me about this case was the video where Micah talked about not wanting to leave her husband or expose her husband because she didn't want people in the church to lose their faith. And that was just so hard to hear because you understood it. You understood she's going through hell, but she also doesn't want all these people who have subscribed to what this guy is doing, who have invested their faith into what this guy is doing. She didn't want those people to fall from the faith that she, holds in her heart. She didn't want them to fall away from that. And that was so hard to hear. And so I hope her legacy is, again, that mission, worship leading, and hopefully having some accountability over a church so that when people walk through those doors on Sunday mornings, there is accountability over, again, people who lead the flock astray. And again, I think John Paul Miller is a textbook example of somebody who does that. His father, I believe, to be a textbook example of somebody who does that. So hopefully Micah's legacy is not only what she was advancing, but helping expose the bad actors in our churches.
This is definitely a story that, at least for me, reminded me of the beauty of collaboration and also the blessing that true crime can be, because it gives you an opportunity to observe something, discuss it, and process it without having to actually go through it yourself. And hopefully in some way that prepares us for what we have to deal with in our own lives, although hopefully it's never tragic. Micah Frances Miller's story isn't just about tragedy. It's about the systems that failed her, the questions that still haunt us, and the voices like hers that refuse to be silenced. In the past year, we've seen an international wave of attention, survivor-led advocacy, and renewed scrutiny of how power, religion, and justice intertwine. Perhaps the most profound impact she's had on our work is this. Micah's story changed how we see the role of journalism, not just in uncovering the truth, but in giving voice to the unheard. As we close this roundtable, we carry forward the lessons she leaves behind, not just as journalists, but as people. And maybe here's another part of Micah's legacy, reminding us that telling the story truthfully, compassionately, relentlessly, that can be a form of justice too. I'm Callie Lyons with FITSNews.